Welcome to the History Maps podcast. When you look at any modern city skyline today, you generally see steel skeletons stretching up into the clouds.
Right, walls of reinforced concrete.
Exactly. Expanses of tempered glass, deep foundations anchored all the way down into solid bedrock. We build with this expectation of defiance against nature.
We do. We utilize materials that are specifically synthesized to resist decay.
Yeah, to resist the weather. We assume our buildings will outlast us by centuries, right? Just standing as rigid monuments against the elements.
But that assumption of permanence is a very modern luxury. Because, well, when you examine the origins of monumental architecture, you find that the earliest metropolises were not built in defiance of their environment.
They couldn't be.
Right, they were built in total unavoidable submission to it. The environment dictated every single structural choice.
Which brings us to this deep dive into the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. And the historical span we are looking at in the sources runs from the 10th millennium BCE all the way to the 6th century BCE.
That is a massive span of time.
It is. And, if you are an aspiring builder in ancient Mesopotamia, you face an immediate catastrophic supply chain problem.
Yeah, you really do, because there are no dense forests for timber.
Right.
There are no mountains to quarry stone. You are just standing on a massive flat alluvial plain.
So you have an abundance of river water, you have heavy clay dirt, you have scarce reeds in the southern marshes, and you have an unforgiving, scorching sun.
That's your entire inventory.
Right. So the question is, how do you construct a sprawling civilization out of wet dirt?
Well, the overarching narrative of Mesopotamian architecture is the absolute mastery of the canvas and the clay. Because, like we said, the region lacked the abundant stone found in Egypt or the timber available in the Levant.
So the inhabitants, the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians had to push mud to its absolute physical limits.
Exactly. The foundational unit of this entire civilization is the mud brick. But it is not just a matter of scooping mud from the riverbank and letting it dry.
Right, because raw clay shrinks. It shrinks and it cracks when the water evaporates out of it.
It does.
If you build a wall out of pure dried mud, it will literally crumble under its own weight, or just shatter the first time the ground shakes.
And the builders understood the material science intuitively. They began with the local clay, deposited by the seasonal flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates.
Okay.
But to prevent the catastrophic cracking you just mentioned, they had to introduce tempering agents into the wet clay.
Like what?
They mixed in straw, sand, gravel, and frequently animal dung.
Let's talk about the mechanics of that temper, actually, because mud is excellent at handling compressive force, meaning you can stack a lot of weight on top of it, but it has almost zero tensile strength.
Right. The second you try to stretch it or bend it, it snaps.
Yeah, exactly.
So the temper provided that missing tensile strength. The fibrous materials, like the straw, acted as an internal binding matrix.
Oh, similar to how we use steel rebar in modern poured concrete.
That is a perfect comparison. It held the block together from the inside out as the moisture evaporated.
So they mix this up, and then what?
Then these tempered bricks were packed into wooden molds to ensure a uniform size, which is, critical for structural integrity when you're building massive walls.
Sure.
And then they were just left out to bake in the fierce Mesopotamian sun.
Okay. So sun-dried mud brick is highly effective for insulation against the brutal summer heat, but it carries a severe, unavoidable vulnerability.
It melts.
It melts. When exposed to heavy rain or the seasonal, often violent flooding of the rivers, a sun-dried brick just dissolves back into the mud it came from.
Which means, fundamentally, a Mesopotamian city was never a static entity. It was an organism in a continuous, perpetual state of decay and regeneration.
Because the sun-dried mud brick naturally deteriorates over time.
Right. Buildings eventually reached the end of their structural life cycle. And when a house became too degraded to patch, the inhabitants did not just abandon the site.
What did they do?
They intentionally leveled the remaining walls, compacted the rubble, and rebuilt a new structure directly on top of the ruins of the previous one.
Okay, so over centuries and millennia, this continuous cycle of building, leveling, and rebuilding on the exact same footprint that gradually raised the elevation of the entire city.
Layer by layer.
Yeah.
And this process created the massive, flat-topped, artificial hills we see dotting the landscape of the Middle East today.
The tells.
Exactly, known as tells. When archaeologists excavate a tell, they are digging vertically through stratified layers of continuous human occupation.
So each layer rests on the compacted, melted mud bricks of its predecessor.
You can slice through a tell and read the architectural history of a civilization going back thousands of years,
Mm.
all stacked in chronological order.
Wait, if the foundational building block of the entire society melts in the rain, how did they construct structures meant to last for generations, like, say, the palaces or the high temples?
Yeah, you cannot have the king's throne room dissolving during a winter storm.
Right.
So for critical civic and religious structures, they utilized kiln-fired bricks.
Okay, so baking them in an oven.
Right. Firing the clay at extremely high temperatures in an enclosed furnace drives out all the internal moisture. It chemically alters the clay and creates a brick that is highly resistant to water erosion.
But there is a catch there, according to the sources. Firing bricks requires immense amounts of fuel to keep the kilns burning at high temperatures for days.
And as we established, this is an alluvial plain with virtually no trees.
Right, fuel was scarce, expensive, and logistically difficult to procure.
Therefore, fired bricks were an extreme luxury. They were deployed highly strategically.
How so?
Builders would construct the massive, voluminous inner core of a temple or palace out of cheap, sun-dried mud brick. And then they'd encase that vulnerable core in a protective outer shell of expensive fired bricks.
Oh, I see.
They also reserved fired bricks for critical infrastructure that dealt directly with water, like drainage channels and courtyards that were exposed to the rain.
The sources also mention a specific evolution in brick design during the early dynastic period, which ran from roughly 2900 to 2350 BCE.
Ah, yes.
They developed something called the plano-convex brick.
The plano-convex brick is a brilliant, highly pragmatic adaptation. Instead of a standard rectangular block with 6 flat sides, the plano-convex brick has 1 flat side and 1 rounded convex side.
So it looks somewhat like a loaf of bread.
Exactly.
But what is the structural advantage of a rounded brick? It seems like it would be way harder to stack evenly.
Well, the irregular shape was actually the point.
Really?
Yeah. When laid in a wall, the rounded top created wider, uneven gaps between the courses of bricks. This allowed builders to pack in much thicker layers of mud mortar.
Okay, I see.
And that increased volume of mortar, combined with the uneven surface, significantly improved the adhesion of the thick mud plaster that was ultimately applied over the finished wall to protect it.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, they laid these bricks in alternating orientations. They'd place headers perpendicular to the wall face and stretchers parallel.
Like a herringbone pattern.
Right. This herringbone pattern helped distribute the structural load and prevented massive vertical cracks from forming.
That brings up a critical question about the mortar itself, though. You are stacking millions of bricks in a floodplain with a high water table.
Yes.
If you use standard mud mortar, the groundwater will just seep up, dissolve the mortar, and the wall collapses from the bottom up.
They solved this with one of the region's most unique and valuable natural resources, bitumen.
Bitumen, which is natural asphalt, right?
Yes, it is an incredibly thick, viscous petroleum product.
And it was sourced from natural seeps where hydrocarbons bubbled up to the surface, particularly along the Euphrates River near sites like Hit and the regions around Mosul.
Craftsmen mined this thick sludge, heated it over fires until it became a workable liquid, and applied it thickly between the layers of fired bricks.
I am just picturing the smell and the heat of that process.
Oh, it must have been an intense, heavy industrial environment.
But as a material, it acts as the ancient world's combination of heavy-duty mortar and absolute waterproof sealant.
Completely. When hot bitumen cools, it solidifies into a bond that is incredibly strong and entirely impervious to water. It was the linchpin of Mesopotamian water management.
So where did they use it mostly?
They used it to seal the deep foundations of palaces against groundwater seepage, to waterproof the terraced roofs of temples, and to line the joints of the city's vast drainage networks.
Because without bitumen, the monumental scale of these cities would have been impossible. The water would have undermined everything.
Exactly. Now, alongside the mud and the bitumen, they incorporated the organic materials growing in the southern marshes.
Specifically, the dense reeds and the date palms.
Right. Reeds grew in massive, towering thickets in the Tigris-Euphrates delta. Builders harvested these reeds, bundled them tightly, and wove them into thick, durable mats.
And what did they do with the mats?
During construction, they would lay these woven reed mats horizontally between the courses of mud brick every few feet, creating continuous layers throughout the structure.
Okay, but what is the mechanical purpose of weaving vegetation into a solid mud wall?
It provides essential flexibility. Mesopotamia is a seismically active region.
Earthquakes.
Earthquakes.
Yeah.
And the deep alluvial soils are prone to uneven settling under immense weight.
Right, and a massive, rigid mud brick wall is brittle. It will crack and shatter under those stress conditions.
So the reed mats acted as a primitive form of tensile reinforcement and shock absorption. They allowed the enormous crushing weight of the structure to settle evenly across the footprint.
Providing the rigid walls with just enough flexibility to absorb seismic tremors without fracturing.
Exactly. And the date palms provided the only reliable source of structural timber.
Because date palm trunks from local groves were utilized for roofing supports.
They are not ideal building timber, to be honest. They are fibrous and prone to sagging, but they were all that was available.
So they served as the primary beams spanning the mud brick walls.
Yes. Over these palm trunks, builders layered smaller branches, more woven reed mats, and finally a thick, heavy layer of mud plaster to create flat, insulated roof spaces.
We should probably clarify that stone was not entirely absent from the architectural record, right?
No, it wasn't absent, but it was a luxury import, and its use was heavily dependent on geography.
Right. In the southern alluvial plains, where cities like Ur and Uruk thrived, stone was practically non-existent.
Save for occasional highly prized pieces brought in for specific uses, like heavy sockets for monumental wooden doors to pivot in.
But in the northern Assyrian highlands, closer to the Zagros Mountains, builders had access to limestone and basalt.
And Assyrian architects utilized this quarried stone for heavy, durable foundations and for orthostats.
Orthostats being the large, upright stone slabs lining the lower portions of the mud brick palace walls.
Exactly. They used them to protect the walls from moisture and physical wear.
If we look at the physics of these buildings, especially the towering structures that reached tens of meters into the air, there is a fundamental engineering problem.
Weight.
Right. How do you deal with the sheer, crushing downward weight of a massive mud structure without the benefit of a modern steel framework?
They engineered battered walls.
What is a battered wall, exactly?
A battered wall is a wall that slopes deliberately and visibly inward from its broad base to its narrower top, typically at an angle of 10 to 15 degrees.
So instead of a straight vertical drop like a modern building, the wall leans back into the structure.
This technique fundamentally counters the immense downward weight of the upper levels by distributing the structural load across a much wider footprint at the base.
It lowers the center of gravity.
It does. Additionally, the inward slope significantly increases the wall's resistance to lateral forces,
Like high winds sweeping across the plains.
or the intense outward pressure of saturated soil during a severe flood. You see this principle of the battered wall applied universally, from the walls of modest domestic housing to the massive, towering defensive walls surrounding the cities.
So the environment dictated the materials, and those materials dictated how everyday people sheltered themselves from the harsh Mesopotamian climate.
Exactly. Let's look at domestic life.
The sources note that the Sumerian word for house is a.
Yes, and the dominant residential design was the courtyard house, or tarban.
Which is an architectural typology so highly adapted to the environment that it remains in continuous use in the Middle East today.
It really is. While housing varied dramatically based on wealth, ranging from simple, single-room reed huts utilized by the poorest laborers in the southern marshes, to sprawling, luxurious elite estates measuring up to 500 square meters in cities like Nippur.
The fundamental organization of the space remained remarkably consistent.
It did.
The standard layout for an urban home was the tripartite plan.
The tripartite plan featured a central, unroofed courtyard that was entirely surrounded by enclosed rooms on three sides.
And this central courtyard was the primary organizing feature of the residence.
All the interior rooms opened directly into the courtyard, rather than connecting to each other via internal hallways. And they certainly did not open outward to the street.
Let's focus on the thermodynamics of that design. Because a courtyard is not just an empty space for a garden, right? It functions as an active climate control system for the entire house.
The open courtyard acted as an atrium. During the day, the high, thick mud brick walls provided deep, consistent shade, preventing direct, punishing sunlight from heating the interior rooms.
Okay.
As the sun heated the ambient air trapped within the courtyard, that hot air would naturally rise.
And this upward movement created a low-pressure zone at ground level.
Exactly, which actively drew cooler air out of the surrounding shaded rooms and pulled fresh air down through the open roofline.
It creates continuous convection currents.
It is a form of passive air conditioning that ventilates and cools the dense mud brick interiors without any moving parts.
Inside these shaded rooms, the management of space was tightly controlled and highly practical, according to the sources.
The furnishings were heavily integrated directly into the architecture to maximize both durability and usable space.
Built-in furniture was the standard.
You would find low, solid benches molded directly out of the mud brick walls, running along the perimeter of the room, utilized for seating during the day or sleeping at night.
And tables were often fixed clay platforms built up from the floor rather than movable wooden pieces.
Because wood was expensive and rare.
And the utility areas reflect the need to manage resources carefully as well.
Kitchens featured robust hearths or domed ovens built directly into the thick walls or the floors, designed for baking flatbreads and preparing meals while containing the heat.
Storage was a critical daily concern too, right? In an arid environment where food security depended on preserving the harvest.
Definitely. Recessed niche shelves were carved into the thick walls to hold pottery jars of oil and water, while the floors often contained deep, plaster-lined pits.
And these pits were utilized to store bulk staple goods like barley and emmer wheat,
Insulating the grain against temperature fluctuations and protecting it from pests and moisture.
We mentioned the flat roofs earlier. In a modern house, a pitched roof is just a lid to keep the rain out. But in Mesopotamia, the roof was an entirely functional, living floor of the house.
Because the roofs were flat, heavily insulated with thick mud plaster, and surrounded by low parapet walls, they were utilized extensively by the family.
During the sweltering heat of the summer months, the interior rooms became stifling by evening.
So the family would move up to the roof to catch the cooler night breezes. The roof provided a primary space for sleeping, dining, and even performing household religious rituals under the open sky.
Now, when you look at the floor plans in the sources, one architectural detail stands out sharply: the intense emphasis on absolute privacy.
Yes. The houses presented entirely featureless, windowless mud brick walls to the public street.
Any small windows they did incorporate were positioned very high up, just under the roofline.
Those high clerestory windows served to let in diffused natural light and allow hot air to escape, while completely keeping out the intense glare of the sun and the prying eyes of neighbors or intruders.
So, if you are walking down a narrow, dusty street in the city of Ur, what does the entrance to a standard home actually look like?
If you approach a standard urban residence, you do not see a grand, inviting doorway leading directly into a welcoming living space.
Right.
You encounter a solid, imposing mud brick wall with a single, highly unassuming opening. Entering from the noisy street, you step into a small, tightly enclosed antechamber.
And you cannot see the central courtyard or the family from that antechamber.
No. The architecture physically forces you to navigate a strict, deliberate 90-degree turn to proceed from the antechamber into the main courtyard.
This is known as a bent access entrance.
It was a crucial design feature. It ensured that even if the heavy front wooden door was left wide open to the street to catch a breeze, anyone walking past could only see a blank interior wall.
Not the private central courtyard where the family lived and worked.
It reflects a rigid, uncompromising cultural division between the chaotic public urban life of the street and the protected private domain of the household.
This strict organization of private space scaled up rapidly when these individual households began to merge and stack together into the world's first dense urban centers.
We see a transition from the individual A to the birth of the urban grid.
The transition from loosely organized, sprawling agricultural villages to highly structured, densely packed urban centers accelerated dramatically during the Uruk period.
Which spanned roughly 4,000 to 3,000 BCE.
Uruk itself serves as the prime architectural example of this explosion in scale. It expanded across over 2 square miles and housed a population estimated between 40,000 and 80,000 people.
And managing that unprecedented density required systematic, intentional urban planning.
The typical Mesopotamian metropolis did not just grow randomly. The builders divided space with specific intent and zoning.
At the absolute core of the city was the High Temple District, the monumental sacred precinct.
Interestingly, this sacred core was often sited slightly off of the exact geographical center of the settlement.
Right. This is because the High Temple usually predated the founding of the city itself. It began as a localized shrine and served as the ancient sacred nucleus around which the urban form grew organically over centuries.
And surrounding that elevated temple core, the city was organized into distinct zones.
The residential areas were highly structured and frequently grouped by profession. You had specialized commercial spaces, bustling harbors along the riverbanks or artificial canals, and dense mixed-use districts where living and working overlapped.
The integration of sacred and economic functions is highly visible in the street layouts. Look at the city of
The ziggurat there, which is the massive religious heart of the city, was flanked immediately by highly specialized, heavily trafficked commercial zones.
Archaeological surveys at have identified distinct commercial neighborhoods pressed right up against the temple complex walls.
Excavators identified a district they termed Baker's Square, where standard residential courtyard houses were heavily adapted into commercial bakeries and smithies.
Complete with massive reinforced furnaces capable of industrial output.
And they found a district they called Store Street.
On Store Street, the domestic architecture was modified to serve as grain merchant facilities.
The builders stripped out the standard living quarters and installed massive brick storage bins occupying the former courtyards and rooms, designed to hold surplus agricultural wealth.
There's even a thoroughfare referred to by the original excavators as Paternoster Row,
Where a traditional house was converted into what functioned as a public restaurant or tavern, with a kitchen opening directly onto the street to serve hot food to the dense, working urban population.
Now, managing tens of thousands of people living side by side in a flat, mud brick environment requires heavy infrastructure.
Yes, and the two most pressing concerns are water management and sanitation.
Because water was the absolute lifeblood of these cities, required simultaneously for massive agricultural irrigation and daily human survival.
Large-scale, highly engineered canal systems were constructed to supply this water and facilitate heavy transport.
The city of Mari, for instance, thriving in the 19th century BCE, was supplied by a massive artificial canal spanning approximately 35 kilometers along the western bank of the Euphrates.
Digging a 35-kilometer trench is one thing, but engineering the gradient so the water flows continuously without stagnating or eroding the banks requires advanced surveying and mathematics.
But inside the city limits, dealing with the water, specifically wastewater and sudden stormwater, is a severe engineering problem.
If water pools in the unpaved streets, the mud brick foundations of the houses will literally melt, and the buildings will collapse into the road.
The solution was a surprisingly extensive buried network of municipal drainage systems.
Beneath the urban streets, builders installed terracotta pipes. These pipes were constructed from interlocking, fired clay rings.
Some measuring up to 30 centimeters in diameter.
You cannot just fit clay rings together, right?
Yeah.
Water will leak out of the joints into the soil.
So they sealed the joints heavily with hot bitumen to prevent any leakage.
These watertight pipes were laid in deep trenches beneath the unpaved or brick-paved streets at a precise downward gradient.
They were engineered to channel domestic wastewater and heavy seasonal stormwater away from the vulnerable residential foundations.
And flush it out toward the river or the main canals. Additionally, small surface drains utilizing half-moon or triangular baked bricks directed runoff from individual household courtyards out through the walls and into these main street gutters.
If you step back and look at the logistics, building a city with paved processional streets, 35-kilometer irrigation canals, buried sanitation networks, and massive temple platforms requires a workforce on a scale the world had never seen before.
It really does.
How did the state organize and feed tens of thousands of laborers without modern machinery, heavy draft animals, or even a standardized monetary economy?
Well, the massive infrastructure of Mesopotamia was built on the foundation of the corvée labor system.
Which is essentially conscripted, unpaid state labor.
It was a highly organized system of civic conscription where free citizens were mandated by law to perform physical labor for the state for a specific portion of the year.
Usually during the agricultural off-season, right?
Right. This massive mobilization of human capital is heavily documented in the surviving cuneiform records, particularly from the Ur III period, around 2100 BCE.
The administrative clay tablets detail the complex logistics of mobilizing thousands of workers simultaneously.
The numbers in the sources are staggering. We are talking about records showing 1,500 men drafted for 5 continuous years just to build the foundation terrace for the temple at Uruk.
The bureaucratic framework required to organize, track, and sustain this workforce was immense.
Provincial governors, overseers, and highly trained scribes operated a massive state apparatus.
They tracked the labor forces using cylinder seals and clay tablets. They allocated vast daily rations of barley, oil, and beer from the central state storehouses to keep the workers fed.
And they oversaw the staggeringly repetitive production of millions of mud bricks, the excavation of millions of tons of earth for canals, and the raising of towering city walls.
Because these cities utilized this labor to accumulate immense wealth, centralize the control of vast agricultural surpluses, and house the administrative power of the entire region, they inevitably became prime military targets.
And this concentration of wealth necessitated massive defensive engineering. We enter the era of the walls of empire.
Urban fortifications had to evolve continuously and massively to counter a trifecta of constant threats.
The devastating seasonal floods, protracted military sieges intended to starve the population, and the rapid development of heavy siege engines, specifically battering rams.
The standard urban defense featured deep, double-layered mud brick walls interspersed with regular watchtowers.
But the city of Babylon, under King Nebuchadnezzar II, who reigned from 605 to 562 BCE, represents the absolute pinnacle of this military engineering.
The scale of Babylon's defensive perimeter is difficult to overstate.
The central city was surrounded by a 14-kilometer perimeter of massive double walls.
Archaeological excavations estimate these combined walls were anywhere from 17 to 22 meters thick and reached towering heights of up to 25 meters.
The classical accounts claim the walls were thick enough to drive a 4-horse chariot along the top, turn it around, and drive it back.
That is a massive physical barrier of millions of baked and unbaked bricks.
And is further protected by a wide, deep artificial moat fed directly by the diverted waters of the Euphrates, essentially creating a heavily fortified island.
They constructed over 100 reinforced watchtowers along this perimeter, rising even higher than the main walls to provide defenders with overlapping fields of archer fire against any approaching army.
The sources outline how siege engineering forced specific architectural adaptations, particularly by the highly militaristic Assyrians in the northern regions.
When a defending force is facing an army equipped with heavy iron-tipped battering rams, a sheer vertical mud brick wall presents a flat, unyielding target.
The kinetic energy of the ram will eventually fracture and shatter the rigid wall.
To counter this concentrated force, Assyrian fortresses incorporated a feature known as the glacis,
which are massive, sloped earthen ramps built against the base of the walls.
They were heavily compacted, angled ramps constructed at the external base of the vertical fortification walls, often faced with slippery, fired brick or stone.
The glacis served multiple defensive purposes. First, the steep angle prevented massive rolling siege towers from getting flush against the wall.
Second, it exposed attacking infantry to a difficult, slow uphill climb while taking heavy fire from the towers above.
But most importantly, the sloping angle deflected the horizontal kinetic force of a battering ram upward, dissipating its destructive energy rather than allowing it to strike the wall dead on.
They also engineered the deep interior of the walls to withstand kinetic impact.
We return to the woven reed mats.
By embedding thick layers of reeds horizontally within the solid, immense mud brick core of the defensive walls, the engineers provided the rigid structure with crucial internal flexibility.
When a massive battering ram repeatedly struck the exterior, the kinetic shock wave transferred deep into the brick core.
The fibrous reed layers absorbed, dispersed, and distributed that shock wave, preventing the rigid mud brick from shattering, cracking, and collapsing inward under the sustained assault.
Passing through these monumental defenses was designed to be a highly orchestrated, deeply intimidating event.
Let's look at Babylon again, the processional way. The road itself is heavily paved with massive limestone flags measuring over a meter square, flanked by borders of red breccia slabs.
The road edges are precisely beveled so rainwater runs off into hidden drains, keeping the pavement pristine.
The walls rising on either side of you are narrow, towering, and sheer, physically forcing you down a highly controlled half-mile corridor.
And the entire length of this narrow corridor is adorned with alternating bas-relief lions, bulls, and the dragon-like mushkushu.
The processional way, known as Aibushobu, led directly to the Ishtar Gate, which was the 8th fortified gateway to the inner city.
The Ishtar Gate was an overwhelming visual spectacle, covered entirely in vibrant, highly polished blue glazed bricks.
The gate featured deep vaulted entrances flanked by massive projecting towers, a military design that strictly controlled physical access and allowed defenders on the roofs to fire down on anyone attempting to breach the threshold.
The psychological intent of the processional way and the Ishtar Gate is brilliant. It was engineered to create a sense of absolute awe, disorientation, and submission long before a foreign envoy or a captive army ever reached the actual centers of political power.
You are dwarfed by the vertical scale of the walls, surrounded by hundreds of fierce, brightly colored avatars of the Babylonian gods staring down at you.
And you are walking on rare imported stone in a land made entirely of mud. It is pure, concentrated imperial propaganda rendered in architecture.
And passing through these heavily fortified and deeply intimidating gates, a visitor would finally arrive at the seat of earthly power, the residence of the ruler, the palace.
The big house.
The Sumerian term for the palace is Egal, which translates directly to Akkadian as Ekalu, meaning big house.
The palace, as a distinct, specialized architectural form, separated from the temple, emerged during the early dynastic period.
It did not start out as a sprawling multi-acre complex, though.
No, the early palaces in the 3rd millennium BCE, like those excavated at the city of Kish, were relatively modest in scale.
They often consisted of simple, secure, two-room suites organized around a small central reception hall and a private chamber.
They functioned primarily as the fortified residence of the lugal, the king or strongman, and provided a secure space for localized, centralized governance and the storage of personal wealth.
But as political power centralized, as kingdoms conquered kingdoms over the centuries, the Iqalu expanded from a simple residence into sprawling, highly complex socioeconomic institutions.
The transformation in scale and function is immense. By the Old Babylonian period in the 18th century BCE, we see structures like the massive Palace of Mari built by King Zimri-Lim.
This single architectural complex covered over 2 hectares of land and contained well over 300 interconnected rooms.
It was no longer just a residence. It was a self-contained, heavily fortified city within the broader city.
Running a 300-room palace requires intense logistical organization. The sources detail how Mari was rigidly organized into specific functional wings.
It featured sprawling administrative wings dedicated entirely to bureaucratic record-keeping, housing thousands of clay tablets detailing diplomacy and taxation.
There were highly secured private quarters or harems for the extended royal family.
Vast, specialized workshops for state-employed artisans crafting luxury goods, and enormous fortified storage vaults designed to hold incoming agricultural tribute and valuable trade goods from across the empire.
Large, sunlit open courtyards served as the primary connective tissue between these segregated zones,
hosting communal gatherings, military reviews, and facilitating the complex movement of thousands of officials and servants.
Then we move chronologically to the Iron Age and the Neo-Assyrian palaces of militaristic kings like Sargon II and Ashurbanipal at cities like Nineveh, Nimrud, and Dushurukin.
Here, the architectural layout becomes incredibly rigid and highly structured.
The Assyrian palaces prioritized strict axial symmetry.
The architecture was weaponized to physically and psychologically guide visitors through a specific, highly controlled sequence of spaces.
You would pass through massive, sun-drenched outer public courtyards, heavily guarded by monumental gateways,
before being channeled along a strict central axis directly into the massive, dimly lit, awe-inspiring ceremonial throne rooms.
The orientation of these palaces was heavily symbolic, often aligned with the cardinal directions to symbolize the Assyrian king's absolute authority radiating across the 4 corners of the cosmos.
The architectural features of these Assyrian palaces are iconic. Let's start with the Bit Halani style.
The Bit Halani is a distinct architectural design influence drawn from the Syro-Hittite regions to the west of Mesopotamia.
It is characterized by a wide, monumental columned portico leading directly to the main throne room.
Typically, 2 long, narrow, rectangular rooms were aligned parallel to the main outer facade.
The columned portico provided a grand, shaded, elevated entrance, visually framing the king when he held court.
It symbolized his accessibility and benevolence to his subjects while maintaining a very clear, heavily guarded physical barrier.
Then you have the orthostats, which completely transform the interior spaces.
We mentioned orthostats earlier as basic protective stone bases against moisture, but in the Assyrian palaces, they evolved into primary canvases for aggressive state messaging.
Huge, heavy slabs of gypsum alabaster, sometimes towering over 2 meters tall, line the lower walls of the major reception halls and the long connecting corridors.
These slabs were carved in exquisite low relief to depict royal hunts and brutal military conquests.
These continuous room-spanning friezes served as both structural protection for the vulnerable mud brick behind them and as highly sophisticated royal propaganda.
They depicted the king in dynamic, muscular combat with ferocious beasts, predominantly lions.
This symbolized his divine mastery over the forces of chaos and untamed nature. Alternatively, they depicted endless lines of chained captives and foreign dignitaries bringing tribute, visually reinforcing his divine mandate to rule the known world.
The detail is astonishing. You can see the musculature of the horses and the embroidery on the robes.
And physically guarding the doorways between these heavily decorated spaces were the lamassu.
The lamassu are colossal, monolithic stone guardians carved from single massive blocks of stone.
They are hybrid, intimidating mythological creatures featuring the intelligent head of a human king, the sweeping wings of an eagle, and the powerful, muscular body of a bull or a lion.
Some of these statues weigh over 7 tons. Moving them from the quarries to the palaces was an engineering feat in itself.
And they were sculpted by the Assyrian artisans with a very specific, brilliant visual trick. They possess 5 legs.
This is a notable detail. They have 5 legs so that they appear completely stationary, planted firmly, and immovable when you view them directly from the front as you approach the gate.
But as you walk past them through the deep doorway and view their side profile, the arrangement of the 5 legs creates an optical illusion,
making the massive stone beast appear to be striding forward confidently alongside you.
It is a masterclass in dynamic spatial sculpture designed to project an aura of active protective power over the king's domain.
When we look at the ruins of these palaces today, or walk through a sterile, brightly lit museum wing lined with Assyrian reliefs, we see bare beige stone.
Right.
Is this monochromatic environment how an Assyrian king or a visiting diplomat would have actually experienced his throne room?
Not at all. That is a massive, fundamental misconception resulting from thousands of years of weathering and early archaeological cleaning techniques.
The visual reality of a Mesopotamian palace was highly saturated, vibrantly painted, and incredibly loud visually.
The sources mention that modern microscopic techniques have revealed traces of the original pigment embedded deep in the stone pores.
Chemical analysis has found extensive remnants of expensive pigments like Egyptian blue, deep reds from ochre, and stark whites and blacks.
The figures on the reliefs, their elaborate garments, the detailing on the weapons, and the backgrounds were all painted in bright, sharply contrasting colors.
Furthermore, the massive wooden cedar timbers supporting the high ceilings were thickly coated in plaster and painted with intricate geometric motifs of stars and rosettes in blue, red, and yellow.
This created a ceiling canopy that evoked celestial themes. The environment of the throne room was a polychrome explosion of color, designed to overwhelm the senses of anyone standing before the king.
But as grand, colorful, and intimidating as the sprawling palaces of the kings were, they were physically dwarfed by the monumental structures built for the true ultimate rulers of the Mesopotamian cities, the gods.
We need to explore the temples and the towering ziggurats.
It is crucial to distinguish between the two architectural forms as they serve different roles. Ground-level temples and the elevated pyramidal ziggurats serve distinct but deeply complementary purposes within the city's religious infrastructure.
The ground-level temple was essentially the physical house of the deity on earth.
Yes. The temple actually housed the sacred cult statue of the god, which was believed to contain the divine essence.
It was the site of intense daily rituals. A temple was a massive, complex facility that integrated the sacred with the administrative.
Temples contained kitchens, breweries, and workshops to accommodate the daily, luminous offerings of food, sacrificed animals, and incense required to literally feed and sustain the gods,
ensuring they remained benevolent and maintained cosmic order.
The layout of these early ground-level temples, particularly from the Jemdet-Nasr period around 3100 BCE, heavily utilized a design known as the bent axis plan.
This is conceptually similar to the bent axis entrance of a private courtyard house, but executed on a much grander scale and imbued with deep religious symbolism.
In a bent axis temple, the main entrance doors from the courtyard were intentionally offset from the inner sanctum, or cella, where the glowing cult statue resided on its altar.
Worshippers or priests entering the temple could not see the god from the doorway. They had to enter the hall and make a deliberate 90-degree turn to face the altar.
This physical turn symbolized the strict separation of secular, mundane space from the intensely sacred, divine space,
enforcing a physical sense of transition, delay, and deep reverence.
Over time, the builders began elevating these temples on low platforms of rammed earth and mud brick to protect them from floods and highlight their importance.
But then the platform kept growing. Layer by layer, century by century, kings added to the platforms until it became the monumental ziggurat.
To understand the architectural form of the ziggurat, you have to understand ancient Mesopotamian cosmology.
They viewed the structure of the universe as a flat disk of land floating on a vast, infinite underground sea of fresh water known as the Epsu.
With a solid hemispherical sky domed above it, regulating the stars and time.
And connecting these three distinct cosmic layers, the heavens above, the earth in the middle, and the subterranean waters below, was a massive world mountain, an axis mundi.
The ziggurat was the literal architectural manifestation of this cosmic mountain built on the flat plain.
We need to clarify this for anyone picturing Egypt. Unlike the Egyptian pyramids, which were hollow, enclosed stone tombs built to house the dead pharaoh, a ziggurat was a completely solid, stepped platform designed to elevate a living shrine to the gods high into the sky.
Precisely. There are no secret chambers inside a ziggurat. They were built in massively receding tiers upon a rectangular or square base.
The ultimate focus for understanding this structure is the Great Ziggurat of Ur, constructed by King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE.
It remains a staggering masterpiece of early geotechnical engineering. Let's break down the sheer dimensions and the construction methodology of the Ziggurat of Ur.
It was originally a three-stage, terraced construction. The lowest, massive basal layer stood about 15 meters high, with base dimensions of roughly 60 by 45 meters.
The second tier rose another 6 meters above that, and the third tier, roughly 3 meters more, crowned at the absolute summit by the small, highly exclusive shrine of the moon god Nana.
And the core of this massive artificial mountain, containing millions of cubic feet of volume, was completely solid, sun-baked mud brick.
Millions upon millions of bricks. But here is the engineering crisis. Because a solid mud brick core of that immense size would act like a sponge, absorbing atmospheric moisture and expanding or quickly succumbing to wind erosion, it had to be encased in an immense, heavy protective envelope of fired bricks.
Set entirely in our favorite waterproof mortar, boiling bitumen.
The fired brick facing on the lowest stage alone was 2.5 meters thick.
Every single one of these baked bricks was stamped with the cuneiform name of King Ur-Nammu, ensuring his legacy was baked into the mountain itself.
Access to the upper tiers was provided by a monumental, deeply dramatic triple staircase that converged at a central, towering portal on the landing between the first and second stages.
But the most impressive, almost hidden engineering detail in the sources is how they stabilized the interior mud brick mass from ripping itself apart.
When modern archaeologists excavated the ruined cores of ziggurats, including the massive Elamite structure at Choka Zenbil, they discovered something unexpected: massive woven reed ropes.
These ropes were incredibly thick, approximately 10 centimeters in diameter. They were laid horizontally and ran entirely through the solid mud brick core of the ziggurat, crisscrossing the interior.
Running right through the center of millions of pounds of dirt.
They functioned as ancient structural tiebacks. Mud has compressive strength, but the outward pressure of millions of bricks stacking up creates intense lateral force.
The thick reed ropes tied the immense mass of the mud brick together, providing critical tensile reinforcement.
This prevented the settling core from bulging outward and rupturing the rigid, fired brick envelope under its own colossal weight. It is a highly sophisticated understanding of load distribution.
To ensure these soaring sacred mountains and the sprawling royal palaces truly reflected the glory and wealth of their patrons, Mesopotamian builders developed highly sophisticated decorative technologies.
We talked about flat paint, but they took architectural decoration to an entirely different level regarding physical durability and brilliant color.
We are talking about the aesthetic of empire. Cone mosaics and glazed bricks.
The evolution of architectural decoration spans thousands of years, from the 4th millennium BCE right through to the Seleucid era.
What is notable is that it began as a highly practical physical solution to weatherproofing mud brick and eventually evolved into an advanced, closely guarded chemical science.
The earliest manifestation of this, found heavily in the Uruk period around 3000 BCE, is the clay cone mosaic.
In the sacred Iana precinct at Uruk, artisans developed a labor-intensive technique using thousands of small fired clay cones, typically 8 to 10 centimeters long, resembling thick nails.
The flat, circular heads of these cones were painted in rich red, black, and white pigments.
The craftsmen would take these thousands of cones and press them deeply into the thick, wet mud plaster coating the exterior walls and the massive columns of the temples.
They arranged them to form vast, sweeping geometric patterns across the walls, spirals, zigzags, interlocking checkerboards.
This served a dual, highly effective purpose. Aesthetically, the repetitive, flawless geometric patterns symbolized cosmic order, stability, and the gods' control over chaos.
But structurally, the hard-baked clay bodies of the cones, embedded tightly together in the soft plaster, created a highly durable, textured, armored shield.
It protected the underlying vulnerable mud brick from the scouring wind and the driving rain.
But the true, world-changing technological leap occurred much later with the development of glazed bricks.
Glazing is a significantly more complex, volatile chemical process than simply baking paint onto a cone.
The technology originated in Elam, in modern-day western Iran, during the second millennium BCE. It involved applying a complex silica-based mixture, known as a frit, to the surface of a prepared brick, and then firing that brick at extremely high sustained temperatures.
The sources quote the Middle Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser I, who reigned in the 11th century BCE, boasting of building towering facades in Nineveh clad with bricks glazed in lapis lazuli color.
Lapis lazuli was a highly prized, deep blue, semi-precious stone imported at great expense from regions like modern Afghanistan. It was the color of the gods.
Creating an artificial chemical glaze that could perfectly mimic that vivid, saturated blue across thousands of bricks was a major statement of unimaginable wealth and technological superiority.
Applying a glaze to clay sounds relatively simple to a modern listener accustomed to mass-produced ceramics, but what made this such a major, precarious technological leap for ancient builders?
It comes down to advanced material science and thermodynamics. The clay body of the brick and the silica-based glass glaze have diverging coefficients of thermal expansion.
Meaning they physically expand and contract at completely different rates when subjected to heat and cold.
Exactly right. When you fire a clay brick coated in a silica glaze in a roaring kiln, the materials heat up and expand.
As the kiln slowly cools down, the glass glaze and the clay brick shrink.
If the chemical rate of shrinkage between the two materials is not perfectly mathematically matched, the glaze will either craze, developing thousands of tiny shattering cracks, or the tension will cause the rigid glass to simply flake and shear completely off the surface of the clay brick.
So, getting the blue glaze to adhere permanently to the brick required mastering the exact chemical composition of the frit, the mineral impurities of the local clay, and precisely controlling the volatile temperatures within the wood-fired kilns.
It required generations of immense mastery and trial and error. By the time of the Neo-Babylonian period under Nebuchadnezzar II, they had absolutely perfected it.
This chemical culmination is most famously seen in the Ishtar Gate and the processional way in Babylon that we discussed earlier.
The state workshops were producing tens of thousands of deeply colored, completely weather-resistant glazed bricks. Brilliant cobalt blues, vibrant yellows, and crisp stark whites.
And they were not just flat, smooth bricks. The artisans were molding the wet clay into high relief before glazing it, creating the three-dimensional bulging muscles of the lions and dragons that lined the defensive walls.
The visual impact of an entire massive gateway and a half-mile processional avenue clad in highly polished, deeply saturated, sun-reflecting blue glass would have been blindingly magnificent in the desert sun.
It represented the absolute mastery over the raw materials of the earth, transforming river mud, crushed quartz, and ashes into a permanent, glittering monument to the empire's eternal power.
But despite the fired bricks, the boiling bitumen mortar, the thick reed mats, and the brilliant shining glazes, the structural core of Mesopotamian architecture always remained earth.
Which leaves us with a profound realization of the ultimate nature of their cities. Because they built primarily, overwhelmingly, with unbaked mud brick, their architecture was defined by its absolute ephemerality.
Unlike the solid stone pyramids of Egypt or the marble temples of Greece, which could stand abandoned and stoic for millennia, a Mesopotamian city was a demanding, living organism that required continuous, active, exhausting maintenance by the entire community.
If the flat roof was not replastered before the winter rains, if the buried drainage channels were not cleared of silt, if the heavy battered walls were not patched with fresh mud after the seasonal floods, the structures would rapidly fail.
The moment a kingdom fell, the moment the corvée labor system stopped organizing thousands of men to repair the canals and patch the walls, the process of architectural dissolution began immediately.
The protective baked brick facades would collapse, and the massive, vulnerable mud brick cores of the ziggurats and palaces would literally melt back into the alluvial plain from which they were raised.
When the maintenance stopped, the cities dissolved back into the landscape, leaving only the elevated, silent mounds, the tells, to hide their vast engineering secrets for thousands of years.
It is a striking, almost haunting image. You start with a muddy, chaotic riverbank. Through sheer will, advanced geometry, and mass human labor, You engineer that dirt into a towering, blue-glazed metropolis of millions of bricks.
But the moment the civilization exhausts itself, the moment the organization falters, the river reclaims it all, turning the greatest cities on Earth back into a muddy, stratified puzzle for modern archaeologists to dig through.
A profound cycle of Earth to architecture and back to Earth again.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.